learning for today is that we're going to be able to find the value of absolute value expressions. In order to do this, we need to think about absolute value expressions and how they fit into the process of evaluating expressions. So to get us thinking about it and activated about that, I've got 3 fill-in-the-blank questions here. I think you should be able to fill in those blanks on your own, so I'm actually going to give you about 30 to 45 seconds to see if you can fill in those blanks on your own. Then we'll try and share out and see what we got. All right, it says in terms of order of operations, absolute value brackets are like what? Bonilla? Parentheses. So we talked about yesterday a little bit how they look like parentheses, and that's kind of a reminder to us. That's a reminder to us that they follow the same order of operations. So we call parentheses absolute value brackets. Other types of brackets, we call those what? We group them into the same category. Song. Grouping symbols, right on. So we talked about that yesterday as well. And so with this in mind, our new order of operations, in other words, you guys used to do PEMDAS, now we do GEMDAS or GEMDAS. However you prefer to pronounce it, it really doesn't matter. It's not in Webster's dictionary, so there's no correct pronunciation. All right. So looking at this, we're going to look at this first one. This first one says we have the absolute value of -4 plus 5. So the first thing we need to do here is deal with Cassandra.
We have to change what's inside the absolute value.
We have to evaluate the absolute value portion. So we have to deal with this grouping symbol here. So this says the absolute value of -4, which is what?
4.
Right on. I do expect to see this step of work. A lot of you are just going to go, oh, I know the absolute value of -4 is 4, plus 5 is 9. I need to see the step. Remember, that step shows me a little bit of how, a little bit of why, which kind of pushes our ideas about how we're thinking about math. And this type of organization, I was looking and working with some of the 8th graders yesterday. They're doing order of operations stuff right now too. It's just a little bit more complicated order of operations stuff. And some of them are saying, man, Mr. Boots, I really wished that I had gotten in better habits in terms of showing my work, because they felt like they couldn't do it without having their work organized step by step. Okay, so keep that in mind. It A, pushes your understanding of how we do things, but B, it sets you up for success in the future. All right, so looking at the next one, we have the absolute value of -23 minus 12. First things first, thinking about order of operations, we have to deal with grouping symbols. So Alvin, what do we need to do? Yep, so we evaluate the absolute value. Absolute value of -23 is a positive 23 minus 12. This is just a regular old subtraction. We're going to switch it anyway, just as a reminder. So we opposite sign subtract. That gives us 11. Take the sign of the larger number. That's positive. All right? Next one. It says 23 minus the absolute value of 12. Again, thinking about our new order of operations. Joshua, what do we have to do first?
We have to turn the 12 is our absolute value, so we just 23 minus plus -12.
Okay, so Joshua is saying that we evaluate the absolute value. Absolute value of 12 is still just 12. And he switches it to a -12. 23 plus -12. Boom. We actually just did this calculation. Brandon, 11. Next one. Here we have two sets of absolute value. One is not inside the other, so we can do them both at once because they're all in the same step. So we want to evaluate our grouping symbols first. We can't do this addition without evaluating the grouping symbols. 25 plus 24. 49. Always evaluating the grouping symbols first. Now the next set is a little bit different because there are things inside the absolute value symbols. And so what do we got to do?
You add, you subtract -6 from 3 and then minus it by 3.
Okay, so first thing I hear him saying is we're treating this like a grouping symbol, and just like any other grouping symbol, like we did in the problem we do now, we have to find the value what's inside. -6 plus 3 is -3 minus 3. Now, here's the difference between grouping symbol or between absolute value brackets and parentheses. Normally when we do parentheses, if this had been 3 plus -6 minus 3, immediately once we found the value of what was inside, it would just disappear, right? That's how it works with parentheses. Does it work that way with absolute value? Kip, yes or Kip, no. Does it work that way with absolute value? No, because that absolute value still has a meaning. We still have to evaluate the absolute value. So we find the value inside the grouping symbol, then we evaluate the absolute value, then we can continue with our order of operations. I'm going to say that one more time because it's super important. And you may want to remember this for later in the period, because you might want to write it down later in the period. I don't know, just forewarning. We evaluate what's inside the grouping symbol, or inside the absolute value symbol. We find the absolute value, then we can move on with order of operations. Okay? So, absolute value here is -3. Of -3 is 3 minus 3. 3 minus 3 is 0. Okay? Next one, step 1. We have to find the value of what's inside the absolute value symbol. First step. That's all we're going to do here. Find the value of what's inside the absolute value symbol. -4 plus 9. Trayana. 5. Now evaluate the actual absolute value. Absolute value of 5 is? Absolute value of 5 is? 5. Now we have 6 minus 5, which is? 1. Okay. Three plus -6, absolute value, plus 3. Okay, what's the first thing that we do? Marquita. Wow. You can do it. What's the first thing we do? 3 So I hear her first, the first thing I hear her saying is, we find what the value is inside the absolute value symbol. Next thing. Jefferson.
After we find what it is inside, we put a value and then turn it into a value.
Yep, we find the absolute value of what's inside there. 3 plus 3 is?
6.
Okay. Next one, order of operations here. First thing we do, Christy. You're one ahead of me. This one's next. He said me. Okay, so after the leaf change switch, we know this is 3, absolute value of 4. So again, first thing we do, we find the value inside the absolute value symbol. Then Tufa?
We multiply 3 by 12. We get 12.
Okay, so we have to find that absolute value, which is 4. And we know that anytime we see a grouping symbol right next to another number, we know that means multiplication. So I'm going to put a multiplication dot in here in between. 3 times 4 is 12. Alvin, question. Alvin, statement. Another statement about the next problem. So I hear Alvin saying that the first thing he wants to do is he wants to find that what's inside that absolute value. So he says that it is 16. Nothing else is going to change. Deidre. We're not ready to divide yet because we've still got absolute value symbols. We have to evaluate that absolute value. So Deidre, what is the absolute value of 16? It's not a trick question. You know this. 16. Now, Deidre, we can divide, and we get say it. I saw your fingers. Yeah. 4. All right. Last one. So this one's got a lot more to it. But everything's still the same. First thing we need to do is deal with the grouping symbol. So Christopher, what is our first step in dealing with this particular grouping symbol? Okay. So you leaf change switch. Okay. Yep. So, hold on. Let's summarize for everybody really quickly. Christopher says, first thing we do, we find the -7 inside the absolute value brackets. And he was getting ready to say we evaluate the absolute value. So that leaves us with 3 times 7 minus 25. Okay, now we need to continue order of operations. Which operation is first, the addition or the multiplication? Multiplication. Remember, Gem Das. M before A and S. 21 minus 25. Have to be really careful here. Winia. Christy. You change switch, of course. Like signs add, opposite sign subtract. So this is opposite sign subtract. It's 4. Take the sign a larger number. Should be negative. So this goes back to Denzel's question from during the do now. We have a expression that has absolute value symbols in it. But the whole thing is not inside the absolute value symbol. So there's other things going on. There are other things going on with this expression other than just the absolute value. So there can be a negative answer. Okay? If everything, the whole expression, or yeah, let's just say 3 minus 4 over 4 squared minus 3x plus 2. If all of it was inside absolute value brackets like that, then yes, the answer would have to be positive. But if there are things outside the absolute value symbols, the answer could be negative. Denzel.
Okay, if you do, why do you do 3 times 7? Wouldn't it usually negative 7?
So remember those absolute value brackets that we saw right here have to be evaluated. And that says this is the absolute value of negative 7 that we're multiplying. The absolute value of negative 7 is 7.
So how come the absolute value of 16 wasn't negative 16?
Remember, absolute value is always talking about how far away it is. No direction, so no negative. Good question.
So if it was 18, it would be 18.
Yep.
If it was negative 18, it would be 18.
Right on. Perfect. All right. Any questions so far? All right, what do we got to do before we move on to our together time? Deidre. Key points. I gave you a big wink, wink, nudge, nudge earlier about one of these key points. Who was listening enough and goes, oh yeah, I get what Mr. Boots was getting at. Tufa.
Only the absolute value. No, only the absolute value can be.
Okay, so this is getting at that last point. So this is definitely one of the key points I had in mind. So she's saying that if there are other operations outside the absolute value, the final value, or the final answer, can be negative. Okay? So the absolute value portion itself will always be positive, but because other things happen outside of that absolute value, it may make it negative. Your final answer. Adolfo. Yep, go for it.
You have to evaluate what you try the absolute value first, and then you evaluate the absolute value, and then continue with the order of operations.
Perfect. All right, so this was the other key point was kind of steps, and he said there are 3 steps here. The first is to find the value inside the absolute value symbols. So I've just drawn a pair of absolute value symbols. I'm going to do us a favor and draw a line here, just so we can tell. Sorry, it's really ugly. Yes, Denzel.
Can you zoom out?
Yes. All right, and then he said, what do we do next? What did he say?
We evaluate the absolute value.
Okay, evaluate the absolute value. So you find the absolute value of whatever was in there. And then what?
You continue with the order of operations.
Continue with order of operations. And just for reminders, I'm going to say continue with GEMDAS. Okay? Questions? Other things that you thought were key? This was actually it for me today, so. But if there are other things that you guys thought were super important, then we should write them down. there are other things that you thought were super important and you don't think for the good of the group that you should say them, write them down for yourself. These are your notes. When you go back to study, these are going to be the things that tell you, hey, this is what I need to remember. Turns out.